It really hits you sometimes how differently people can see the same thing. Take this story I read about Doug, a 16-year-old involved in some pretty serious stuff. What blew me away was that he actually looked up to characters in movies that most of us would see as like tragic warnings, films like South Central and Boys in the Hood.
hmm
He saw them as a guide, not a cautionary tale. It makes you stop and think, how can one story lead to such wildly different moral takeaways?
That's a powerful example, and it gets right to the heart of what we're exploring today. It seems obvious that people interpret things differently, but understanding how and why that happens, especially when it comes to moral information, is actually, well, quite complex. Our brains aren't just sponges soaking up information, they're actively building understanding based on what we already know.
Exactly. And that's the deep dive we're taking today. We're going to unpack how each of us processes moral information from the world around us. Stories, news, personal experiences. We've been looking at some fascinating research in discourse processing and moral judgment, and it really shines a light on why those aha moral moments can be so personal and varied. Our mission, basically, is to understand the cognitive gears turning when we interpret right and wrong.
Right. So, to get a handle on why Doug might see those films as a roadmap while others see danger signs, we need to talk about something called discourse processing theory. In simple terms, this theory looks at how we construct mental pictures and understanding from any kind of communication, a movie, a book, even this conversation. It gives us a way to understand how we make sense of everything, including the moral messages we encounter.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we process all the information that comes our way?
Well, discourse processing theory suggests two main pathways. The first is bottom-up processing. Think of it as being driven by the raw data. We're taking in the literal information, the specific words, the images, the sounds. For instance, if you hear me say, Tristan threw his jeans into the washer, your brain first processes each word individually. Who did what to what?
Got it. We're just absorbing the basic facts. What about the second way?
The second way is top-down processing, and this is where our individual interpretations really start to diverge. This is driven by our existing knowledge, our expectations, and what we call schemas. Schemas are like mental blueprints or frameworks we have for how things generally work.
Schemas like mental shortcuts based on past experience.
Precisely. Let's go back to the laundry example. When you then hear into the washer, it likely activates your laundry schema. Suddenly, you're thinking about things like detergent, different washing settings, maybe sorting clothes. So when I then say he sorted the rest of the items by color, you immediately understand that the rest of the items probably means more clothes because it fits right into your activated laundry schema.
I see the power of that. Our expectations really color how we interpret new information.
Exactly. And here's a key insight. Our expectations can even lead us to misinterpret things and, well, warp our memories. Remember the famous War of the Ghosts study? People from one culture read a folktale from another, and as time went on, their retellings of the story changed to fit their own cultural norms, even details they hadn't initially remembered correctly. So the key insight here is that our brains aren't just recording information, they're actively rewriting it to fit our existing understanding, even when we don't realize it. Research even shows we tend to misremember routines from other cultures to be more like our own.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how our background acts like a filter for everything we take in. So how does this whole idea of discourse processing help us understand moral thinking specifically?
Well, researchers realized that these same tools we use to understand any kind of information could be really helpful for seeing how people make sense of moral situations. Instead of just asking someone what they think is right or wrong in a general sense, we can use these techniques to see how they actually process moral information as they encounter it, in stories or real life.
Okay, so what kind of studies have been done in this area?
There are two main types. Offline studies, which look at our understanding after we've engaged with the information, and online studies, which examine our processing while it's happening. Let's start with offline studies. One method is narrative recall. For example, in some research, both middle schoolers and college students read stories that included moral arguments based on different levels of moral reasoning. Researchers often talk about stages of moral reasoning, like Kohlberg's model, looking at how our understanding develops from, say, focusing on punishment and reward to more complex ideas of justice. After reading, the participants had to retell the stories.
And what were the results? Did they remember things differently?
Interestingly, yes. Both groups remember the simpler moral arguments, those focused on getting rewarded or avoiding punishment, pretty much equally well. However, when it came to the more complex arguments about justice and the greater good things like understanding the purpose behind laws, not just following them blindly, often called stage 5 reasoning, the participants who scored higher on separate tests of moral judgment were much more likely to remember those arguments. Ah, okay. So higher reasoning meant better recall of higher reasoning.
Exactly. And even more surprisingly, they sometimes even reconstructed those higher-level arguments in their retellings, even if they weren't explicitly stated in the original story.
Wow. That really brings Doug's situation into sharper focus. It suggests that his level of, well, his moral understanding might have actually prevented him from even registering the intended moral messages in those films.
It really does. It implies that our existing moral framework influences what we pay attention to and what sticks with us from moral narratives. And to see if this held true for adults, researchers also did similar studies with university students and even graduate students in fields like political science and philosophy, people who, spend a lot of time thinking about moral issues.
Mm.
And the pattern held. Those with more expertise in moral reasoning were better at recalling the more complex moral arguments, even when their general reading comprehension was taken into account. Expertise in moral reasoning isn't just about knowing more, it seems. It's about how you actively analyze and process moral information. So it's not just about being a good reader. Your actual capacity for moral reasoning shapes how you understand moral content. That's really something.
Precisely. Another fascinating area of offline research explores whether children actually grasp the moral lessons we think we're teaching them through stories. There's this common assumption, right, that reading kids moral stories automatically makes them more moral. But is that really the case? Studies have looked at whether children can even identify the intended moral themes in these stories.
How do you even test something like that with kids?
Well, researchers use stories designed to highlight different moral concepts: honesty, helping others, fairness, things like that. After reading a story, they would give children of different ages, as well as adults, a multiple choice task. They had to pick the main moral lesson of the story. For example, a story might be about someone who found a lost wallet and had to decide whether to return it. The choices would include the intended moral, like honesty is the best policy, but also more surface level interpretations, like finding things can be exciting.
Right. And were there big differences in how the different age groups responded?
Absolutely striking differences. The younger children really struggled to identify the intended moral themes. Across various stories, they only picked the correct moral around, wait for it, 11% of the time.
11%.
Yeah, 11%. Meanwhile, adults were getting it right about 91% of the time. The younger kids tended to focus on the literal events in the story, the actions, rather than the deeper moral message. So that common belief that simply reading moral stories makes children moral is, well, largely unsupported by this research.
11%. That's a really surprising statistic. Wow. It definitely makes you question whether those bedtime stories are having the impact we think they are.
It does. It suggests that simply exposing children to these narratives isn't enough. Their understanding of abstract moral concepts is still developing, and they might be missing the intended lessons entirely.
So those are the offline studies, looking after the fact. What about the online studies that look at how we process moral information as it's happening?
Right. These studies use methods to tap into our cognitive processes in real time as we're actually engaging with moral content. One technique is called think aloud protocols. Researchers have participants read moral narratives and literally verbalize everything they're thinking as they read. This gives us a direct window into their moment-by-moment understanding.
That sounds like a really insightful way to see how people are making sense of things.
Right.
What did those studies reveal? Any big differences?
Oh, yeah. What was fascinating was the difference between those considered experts in moral reasoning, like philosophy graduate students, and those with less expertise, say, undergraduate students. The experts showed a much deeper engagement with the text. They asked more questions, made more connections to other ideas, and critically evaluated the arguments presented in the story much more frequently.
Right, like questioning the assumptions.
Exactly. And they're also better at identifying inconsistencies or points where the narrative didn't quite make sense. It's actually similar to how experts in other fields, like chess or medicine, approach information within their area of expertise. They're more analytical, more predictive.
So it's not just about having a library of moral rules in your head. It's about having a more active and analytical approach to moral situations as you encounter them.
Exactly. And to get even more precise about what's happening in the brain, as we process moral information, another type of online study uses something called lexical decision tasks.
Lexical decision task. Okay, that sounds very scientific. Break that down.
It is a bit technical, but the basic idea is simple. While people are reading moral stories on a computer, they're briefly shown flashes of letters and have to quickly decide if those letters form a real word or not. Some of these flashed words are related to moral concepts. Think of it like this. If you're already thinking about betrayal, you'll recognize the word disloyal much faster than if you were thinking about, I don't know, breakfast.
Mm,
Lexical decision tasks use this split-second recognition time to see what moral concepts are being activated or primed in someone's mind while they read.
that's clever. So what kind of moral concepts were researchers looking at in these studies? What were they trying to find?
Well, one really interesting study focused on how our cultural backgrounds specifically, whether we come from a more individualistic culture versus a more collectivistic culture, influences our immediate, almost unconscious moral reactions. Participants from different cultural backgrounds read stories about someone deciding whether or not to help a family member. Some stories describe them helping, others describe them not helping. Then, at key points, they were shown those moral probe words. For instance, after a story where someone didn't help their relative, a word like disloyal that would flash on the screen.
And did they find that cultural background influenced how quality people recognize those moral words? Like, did collectivists react faster to disloyal?
They did, significantly. People who identified more strongly with collectivist values, where group harmony and interdependence are really important, were much faster at recognizing moral words that fit the situation described in the story, especially the negative ones like disloyal in the no-help scenario. The profound takeaway here is that our cultural background can trigger these automatic moral evaluations, these gut feelings, even before conscious thought really kicks in.
That's really eye-opening. It shows how deeply ingrained our beliefs and values are and how they can shape our immediate understanding of events, like on a pre-conscious level.
Absolutely. And these online methods like think alouds and lexical decisions give us a much richer, more detailed picture of moral cognition than just looking at someone's overall moral judgments after the fact. They allow us to see the moment-to-moment processes involved in understanding moral information and how these processes can differ based on things like expertise, development, and even cultural background.
So, to bring it all together, it seems like the message we intend to send, especially when it involves morality, can be significantly changed or even completely lost depending on who's receiving it. It's not straightforward at all. Our existing knowledge, how we tend to process information top-down versus bottom-up, and even our cultural lenses all play a huge role in how we interpret things.
That's really the core message, yeah. Whether it's a filmmaker trying to convey the consequences of violence, like in your opening example, or a parent trying to teach a child a lesson through a story, or even just trying to communicate effectively with someone from a different background, we need to remember that the message we put out there isn't always the message that's understood. There's a whole interpretive layer happening in the listener's or reader's mind.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. Consider the implications for how we educate, right, or how we communicate across cultures, and maybe even why we see so much division in society. If our fundamental interpretations of events, of stories, of moral situations can be so different, what does that mean for our ability to find common ground and build understanding? It's a fascinating and kind of crucial question to keep wrestling with.